The truth about the ego is often shrouded in layers of misunderstanding. Many have heard the phrase, "you must let go of your ego," yet few understand precisely what it means. In spiritual circles, ego is sometimes cast as the villain, a trickster that leads to pain and ignorance. Meanwhile, some modern psychologists see the ego as the seat of identity, vital for emotional well-being and personal growth. Depending on which vantage point you adopt, spiritual, psychological, or philosophical, you'll find different interpretations and even contradictory insights. Yet at the core, the notion of ego touches upon fundamental questions. Who am I? Why do I act as I do? Is there a deeper self behind my everyday sense of I? This text aims to explore the truth about the ego with an integrative lens, weaving together spiritual, philosophical, and psychological threads to show how can both block and facilitate our growth, and how truly understanding it might open a door to liberation. The Vietnamese term ban nga typically translates to ego in English, but that direct translation can overlook nuances. Ban na literally connotes the self or the inherent self-nature, but in many spiritual traditions, it indicates the illusions and identifications we mistakenly carry, things that we assume define us, but that do not, in essence, define who we truly are. The illusions revolve around ephemeral details like name, reputation, possessions, role, or personal story. Over time, we become so deeply identified with these ephemeral details that we forget the deeper dimension of who we might be. However, is the ego purely an illusion, or does it serve a function on the journey of life? One perspective is that the ego emerges as a survival mechanism. In evolutionary terms, the development of personal identity helps human beings navigate their environment to ensure bodily survival, to stake boundaries, to categorize experiences. Indeed, from a practical standpoint, having a cohesive sense of I is beneficial. You need to know that I am separate from the tree, the rock, the other person, so that you can fulfill daily tasks. Without that rudimentary sense, you might even fail to feed yourself. Thus, in purely functional terms, the ego is not evil. It's the mental structure that organizes your experiences, your memories, your sense of past and future. But the trouble arises when that structure, designed as a support tool, becomes the tyrant when we let it rule unchallenged. Instead of being a useful reference point, it becomes the center of all existence. We cling to my achievements, my possessions, my status, my regrets. Ego inflates itself, seeing everything from my vantage point, reworking events so that they revolve around me. The spiritual traditions often call this identification with the ego, meaning you forget that you are more than just that mental construct. Instead of acknowledging that the I concept is a flexible, functional interface with reality, you believe that is the totality of your being. And that, say the wise, fosters illusions and suffering. To understand the truth about the ego, we might re-express it in simpler form. The ego is the sum of your attachments to a personal story. The reason it causes trouble is that life is inherently impermanent. If you cling to an identity that I am important, I must always be recognized, or I can never fail, reality inevitably undermines that assumption, leading to frustration, fear, anxiety, or anger. For example, if your sense of self depends on being physically strong, age or illness might strike, and you feel worthless. If your sense of identity rests on moral superiority, encountering your hidden impulses can devastate you. The more rigid your self-image, the more violently you suffer when circumstances shift. Hence, spiritual teachings like Buddhism, or certain mystical branches of Christianity and Sufism, emphasize letting go of attachments to illusions about the self. In that sense, the ego is a kind of mental program or personal narrative we keep reinforcing. However, we have to be careful not to demonize it. The moment we say, "The ego is the enemy, I must kill it," we may ironically feed the ego further. Why? Because the very sense of, "I am the one who kills the ego," is another subtle ego claim. The deeper approach is to see the ego's illusions as illusions. Illusions recognized evaporate naturally. So the process is not about violent suppression. but about gentle self-inquiry and awareness. One difficulty is that the ego rarely announces itself plainly. It masquerades in cunning ways. It can appear as a victim mentality, a subtle sense of, I'm worse off than others, or it can show up as arrogance. It can also show up as spiritual vanity, ironically, when we fancy ourselves so holy and awakened that we judge others. It might appear as a moral stance, I am such a good person, and I must correct everyone around me. In short, the ego is the shape-shifter par excellence. That's why so many advanced practitioners across the centuries have said, the deeper you go, the trickier the ego becomes. They do not necessarily want you to fear it, but to remain vigilant, like a watchman, aware that illusions can slip in disguised as clarity. Another major reason the ego is so persistent is that it's intimately tied to our emotional memories. From childhood, we accumulate beliefs about who we are, shaped by parents, siblings, peers, teachers. We start forming an identity. I am the one who's good at math. I am the shy one. I am unlovable. Later in adulthood, we fuse these beliefs into a stable sense of identity, layering them with experiences, successes, traumas, regrets. The conscious mind forgets half of these stories, but the subconscious mind keeps them alive, forming a private narrative we cling to whenever challenges surface. So if someone tries to challenge me, I might respond not from fresh presence, but from the old wounded identity that says I must defend myself. That's the ego at work, a swirling mass of old stories that insist on being relevant right now, even if reality has changed. So what does it mean to transcend the ego? Many misinterpret that phrase as stop having a sense of identity, but that is neither feasible nor helpful. A more accurate notion is to no longer be enslaved by the illusions or demands of identity. In other words, you still have a functional sense of I, enough to do your daily tasks, but you see that sense as a tool, not as your final or essential truth. You can shift perspective. I see that my pride is being triggered by this critique. Instead of blindly reacting, you watch it. Then you choose how to respond from a place of deeper wisdom. The difference is that you no longer believe my sense of self must remain unchallenged. Instead, you remain open to what is real, even if it means adjusting or shedding some piece of identity. One classic technique for unveiling the truth about the ego is self-inquiry, famously taught by sages like Ramana Maharshi, who'd say, "Ask who am I?" The question is not meant for intellectual answers, but for a direct unveiling. Each time you find a statement, I am John, the first am 40 years old, I am a teacher, I am a father, you see that these are roles or labels. Keep going. No, behind all that, who am I? Eventually, you find no conceptual anchor, but rather a pure awareness or presence. On discovering that dimension, you realize the egoic narrative is ephemeral. This is not a denial of your daily identity. You still do your job, care for your family, etc. But now, you see that the fundamental I transcends those roles. The ego is more like an operative layer, not the depth of who you are. At the same time, we must ask, if the ego is so ephemeral, why do we hold on to it so tightly? Some say it's fear. Fear of dissolving into the unknown. Fear that without the I, we might not exist. Indeed, that fear can be intense. The idea of stepping beyond illusions that define us can feel like psychological death. The path of spiritual awakening often includes confronting that fear. Many wise people caution that the awakened state is not about living in numbness or emptiness, but about discovering that real emptiness is luminous, peaceful, and full of potential. By letting go of illusions, we ironically find a more real sense of being. But from the ego's perspective, that is death, so it fights tooth and nail. Hence, the testament of the ego, or the last testament of the self, can be quite dramatic. People might experience crises like existential dread, depression, or an identity meltdown. When certain illusions crack, that meltdown can be terrifying, yet also the threshold to a deeper freedom. Many spiritual traditions describe a dark night of the soul, a period of deep confrontation where illusions get stripped away. If one perseveres with awareness and humility, On the other side is liberation from the tyranny of the old false self. But if one flees, the illusions reassert themselves, and the cycle of suffering continues. Let's also discuss how illusions specifically form. The ego thrives on comparison. I am better than them. I am worse than them. I must catch up. I must prove something. This is how it measures its significance in a social context. In a tribal or community sense, that might have been helpful for group cohesion. But nowadays, with mass media and social networks, the comparisons are endless and global. The ego is bombarded with images of successful people, perfect lifestyles, and so forth, which intensify craving, jealousy, or shame. The sense of, I need to become that, or I can't stand being lesser than that, becomes the engine of consumerism and perpetual dissatisfaction. On that note, the consumer culture effectively harnesses the ego's illusions to feed it with illusions of deficiency and fantasies about how certain products or experiences might fix that deficiency. If you reflect calmly, you see that an entire economic system is partially fueled by the insecurity of the ego. Also important is the phenomenon of spiritual ego. Ironically, people who move into spiritual practice or discover special experiences might unconsciously feed a new form of pride. I am so awakened. I see beyond illusions. I'm more advanced than these normal folks. That is still the ego, now wearing a spiritual mask. The real transformation has not happened. We just replaced I'm worthless with I am the best guru. The method to handle that is not more condemnation or guilt, but noticing the pattern. Oh, the separate self is reasserting itself in a new way. Then we watch, breathe, and let that story pass. Little by little, illusions lose their hold. But what about daily life? The truth about the ego includes how it influences your relationships, your career, your emotional well-being, your sense of success or failure. If your identity is rooted in your job title, your money, your personal story, then any threat to those things shakes your entire being. If you identify strongly as the nice person, you become unable to set healthy boundaries, or you might resent anyone who does not appreciate your kindness. If you identify as the misunderstood genius, you might sabotage relationships to prove your uniqueness. In each scenario, the illusions create conflict. Only by seeing these illusions as illusions can you spontaneously respond to life with clarity and compassion. One might wonder, so is the ego always destructive? Potentially, no. In some psychological contexts, a healthy sense of self is crucial. If you have no sense of your boundaries or your personal worth, you might be exploited or depressed. So from a personal development angle, building an ego is necessary in earlier stages. The real issue is outgrowing a limited ego once it has served its function. In the standard human timeline, as children, we might start with an unrefined ego. We refine it, build self-esteem, self-reliance, and eventually, in spiritual maturity, we see beyond it to a deeper essence. The problem arises if we remain stuck at the stage of only ego, refusing to see there is more. That leads to spiritual stagnation. Therefore, a more balanced approach might be, we appreciate the ego as a tool, but we do not mistake it for our true identity. That attitude fosters humility, curiosity, and readiness to adapt. For instance, if you realize, I've grown attached to my image as a strong leader, you do not shame yourself, but gently investigate. Why am I so attached? Is there fear beneath it? Then you might uncover a childhood memory where you were bullied, thus you sought strength as a compensation. Realizing that, you can integrate the child within, showing them love. The illusions start melting, replaced by genuine compassion for yourself and others. That is how unveiling the truth about the ego can lead to healing. In many references like Tolle's A New Earth or Gurdjieff's self-remembering approach, the ego's illusions are shown to revolve around unconscious patterns. People live on autopilot, continuously reacting from memory, repeating the same triggers. If you want freedom, the first step is to notice how your I arises in each moment. For example, you might see that you keep telling the same personal anecdote that glorifies you or demonizes someone else. You might see that you cannot stand certain criticisms, Observing all that without condemnation, but with a mindful attitude, you gradually free yourself. The illusions cannot survive close scrutiny. From the vantage of Buddhism, the ultimate truth about the ego is emptiness of a separate self, that the self is a flow of causes and conditions, with no permanent ego entity. The I is a verb, not a noun, so to speak. Once you realize that, you do not become catatonic. Rather, you can function with more fluidity. The same perspective can be gleaned from the mystical sides of Christianity, e.g., he who loses himself gains everything. So across traditions, the message is consistent. The self that you think you are is not the final or absolute you. By letting that pseudo-self go, you awaken to a broader cosmic identity or union with God, or the absolute. That might feel lofty, but it has everyday implications. Let's say you typically get angry in traffic if you get cut off. The ego says, I was disrespected. That is an identity-based story. I must be respected. If you see it's just an illusion, you do not condone dangerous driving, but you also do not lose your peace. You might calmly respond or keep your composure. Freed from the illusions, daily life becomes more peaceful, because each small event no longer threatens your sense of self. An interesting question is, how does the ego shift in a group dynamic? Some find that in spiritual communities or in workplaces, certain individuals become self-appointed leaders who believe I am special. This fosters hierarchy or rivalry. Again, illusions. The deeper truth is that we are all expressions of one universal consciousness, playing different roles. When we forget that, the illusions multiply, leading to conflict. Then, ironically, the group that set out to practice higher truth falls into petty disputes. Observers conclude, they're no different from any other group. In many ways, the illusions about being spiritually advanced are more harmful because they keep people from humbly seeing that the ego still holds power. The real question then becomes, how do we handle illusions concretely? Many traditions advocate daily reflection or journaling. What triggered me today? Where did I sense separation or fear? What stories am I telling? Others recommend a consistent practice of meditation or breathwork to watch the mind in real time. Whenever a strong emotion arises, you see how the I thought emerges around it. You do not fight it, but name it. Ah, that's my self-defense story. Over time, a silent awareness emerges that is not identified with any story. That silent awareness is sometimes called the real self, or no self. That is paradoxical language, but it points to the same phenomenon, a stable presence in the midst of changing phenomena. Freed from illusions, life is more harmonious and purposeful. One might wonder about the future of the ego. As humankind evolves, there's a possibility more people discover the illusions and unify with a deeper sense of being. Technology might help or hinder that. We see how social media fosters a me-based culture, intensifying illusions. On the other hand, global connectivity might also spread spiritual knowledge. The outcome depends on each individual's willingness to see the illusions for what they are. The truth about the ego is not an external doctrine, but an internal realization. No matter how many times you read about it, you must verify it within. If you do, you might discover that the illusions melt away like fog in the morning sun, revealing a luminous presence. We must also address the role of suffering in dissolving illusions. Often it is precisely heartbreak, failure, or disillusionment that cracks the shell of the ego. People say, I was so sure of myself, until that big loss taught me I was clinging to illusions. In the aftermath, a genuine humility or open-heartedness can appear. This phenomenon is well known. It is as if the ego's illusions protect themselves until life's storms come, smashing them, leaving us raw and vulnerable. In that vulnerability, an inner grace might awaken, leading us to the deeper truth. So ironically, illusions can be undone by crisis if we're receptive. If we remain resentful or proud, we might instead deepen illusions or create new ones. Poor me, I'm cursed. It's all someone else's fault. That is the victim ego narrative. Another trap indeed. Hence, illusions do not automatically fade with age or suffering. They fade only if we allow awareness to see them. Some might get older, but remain as rigid as ever in their sense of identity. Some might suffer repeatedly, but blame external circumstances. So it's not guaranteed. But for many, the cracks in illusions come from adversity, heartbreak, the so-called dark night. That is an invitation to realize, wait, who am I beyond these ephemeral attachments? From that question arises a new dimension of being. What if, however, illusions aren't all negative? We might speculate that illusions also color our creativity, giving us roles to play in this cosmic drama. Some mystics claim that the entire manifested universe is a play of illusions, a Leela. So the ego illusions are not to be destroyed, but recognized as illusions that we might continue to dance with consciously. That perspective is often found in certain forms of non-dual tantrism or in Sufi poetry, where life is a divine game. The difference is that we do not take the illusions as final or binding. We can slip in and out of roles gracefully. So illusions are illusions, but recognized as parts in a play. That might indeed free us from heaviness. Nevertheless, the fundamental sticking point is that illusions become suffering whenever they are taken as absolute truths. For instance, if you think your role as teacher is absolutely who you are, the day you lose your job or retire, you might feel worthless or depressed. You forgot that was just one mask you wore. On the other hand, if you see from the start that teacher is a functional role, you can transition smoothly when circumstances change. In that sense, illusions are illusions simply because they are ephemeral forms. They are not bad forms, just impermanent. The problem arises only if we cling, expecting them never to shift. Another subtopic is whether illusions can be used intentionally for growth. Some schools of therapy, for instance, might create positive illusions, like reframing your personal narrative to empower you. You might adopt the story, I am strong enough to overcome adversity. That might well be an illusion in some ultimate sense, but it's a beneficial one if it helps you act confidently. Yet in a deeper spiritual sense, even beneficial illusions must eventually be transcended, once they have served their purpose. This is reminiscent of the famous Buddhist analogy that the teachings are like a raft for crossing the river. Once you reach the far shore, you do not keep carrying the raft on your back. Even the notion of, I am strong enough, is a mental formation. So illusions can be stepping stones or guides, but the ultimate freedom arises when you see them as illusions. You are not discarding them cynically, but gracefully letting them go. Hence, the truth about the ego is also the truth about illusions, stories, identifications. And the deeper truth about illusions is that, ironically, illusions do not exist in themselves. They exist only as partial truths mistaken for the whole. The mind latches onto them, ignoring the infinite context. Once we see it, illusions lose their power. The process might be described as waking up from the dream of me. In that dream, you took yourself to be a separate entity, fighting for survival or recognition, never quite secure. Waking up reveals you as a field of awareness that includes everything. The little me is still there, but more like a wave on the ocean. This shift is the hallmark of mystical traditions. The difference is that you no longer identify with the wave exclusively. You realize you are also the ocean. And that perspective is not an intellectual stance, but a felt reality. Of course, none of this means you become passive or lose a sense of individuation. Many people fear that losing illusions is akin to losing all personality or individuality. On the contrary, from the accounts of awakened practitioners, letting illusions go might allow your uniqueness to blossom more naturally. Free from the constraints of fear and false pride, you can fully express your talents, your style, your humor, but they do not define your essence. That is the paradox. Illusions hamper genuine expression by making you live in constant self-defense. Letting illusions go frees you to be spontaneously yourself, anchored in the deeper presence. In everyday life, illusions and the ego can be recognized through triggers. Suppose you find yourself disproportionately upset over a small comment. Right there, you see that your self-image is threatened. That's a clue. Illusions are at work. Another clue is when you judge or envy people for having something you want. That envy reveals that the sense of, I want to be that, but I am not, is fueling discontent. Another clue is mania or arrogance, a sense that I am unstoppable, so special. That might be a sign the ego illusions have inflated. By seeing such clues with mindfulness, you can unravel the illusions on the spot. Yes, that is my old story, not my real being. Over time, illusions weaken. It's helpful to remember that illusions never fully vanish once and for all, in a single moment for most people. Even deep spiritual transformations might keep residual illusions that can emerge. That's why advanced practitioners maintain daily vigilance. Indeed, advanced masters might still find subtle pride or attachments lurking, so they keep practicing humility, self-observation, loving service. Doing so is not a sign of being flawed, but rather of living in a constantly shifting world, where illusions can reattach themselves if you lose presence. In bridging the East-West philosophical gap, we can see that many modern psychologists talk about the constructed self, the idea that the I is shaped by social and cultural factors. Meanwhile, older spiritual traditions talk about no self or non-ego. They are describing the same phenomenon from different angles. The psychologist might emphasize the functional aspects of ego development, while the mystic emphasizes the illusions that hamper direct experience of oneness. Understanding both can yield a holistic approach. We can cultivate a healthy, functional ego, so we can navigate daily tasks, relationships, responsibilities, but also realize that behind it is a deeper self or presence, which does not cling to the illusions. The testament of the ego, as some put it, is that it tries to claim the final say, without me, there is no life. But many spiritual luminaries discovered the opposite. The deeper dimension of being is more alive and free once illusions dissolve. The illusions might produce short-term stability or fleeting pleasures, but also a consistent undercurrent of fear or insecurity. Freed from illusions, ironically, you can become far more stable from within, not at the whim of external events. Finally, one could ask if illusions are an integral part of the cosmic play. Maybe the universal intelligence wants us to start out in illusions so that we can discover truth by peeling them away. Like children initially believing in Santa Claus only to learn deeper facts. As they mature, perhaps illusions serve as a scaffolding. Then the illusions break, enabling a new stage of understanding. If that is so, illusions are not mistakes, but stepping stones on the evolutionary path. The difference for each person is whether they cling to illusions beyond their rightful time, or gracefully let them go when the next level beckons. In conclusion, the truth about the ego bandinga is that it is real in a relative sense, a functional identity needed for your day-to-day tasks, but illusory in an absolute sense, because it doesn't capture your fundamental being. It is an evolving cluster of ideas, memories, beliefs that can become rigid and hamper your spiritual freedom. Illusions form the core of that rigidity, and only consistent self-awareness and willingness to question can loosen them. As illusions fade, you do not become nobody, you become what you always were, a living presence, not definable by limited roles. Then you can still play roles in daily life, but with a sense of fluidity, compassion, and authenticity. When illusions no longer bind you, you respond spontaneously, from the heart, from direct insight. You do not see the world in terms of me against them, or my story as ultimate. Instead, you witness the interplay of life, seeing each role as ephemeral, each person as a spark of the same essence. That shift is often described as awakening from the dream of separation. The illusions of the ego do not vanish in the sense of never showing up, but their power to enthrall you is broken. That is the core. The illusions remain illusions, but recognized as illusions, they cause no more trouble. Hence, the real journey is not about eradicating or demonizing the ego, but about seeing illusions for what they are, fleeting narratives. And ironically, discovering that does not hamper your daily functioning, it liberates it. You become more flexible, more empathetic, more open. So the truth about the ego is ironically the truth about your own boundless nature behind the illusions. Freed from illusions, you are not imprisoned by false boundaries. You can do what is necessary with grace and not be undone by praise or blame, success or failure. That is, in short, the fruit of seeing illusions clearly. The ban Noah need not be an enemy but a transient phenomenon that the real you can use or set aside. And that is, in the final sense, how illusions relinquish their hold and your deeper self stands revealed.